Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Joseph Constable. I'm head of exhibitions here at the Warr Pavilion. It's wonderful to see so many of you on this sunny Saturday in Bexhill. And today is a very special day here at the Pavilion as we are officially reopening Tschablala Self's monumental sculpture, Seated, situated on our lawns outside, which follows, a difficult few weeks, very challenging act of vandalism that happened to the sculpture, which was then, of course, followed by the amazing restoration event that many of you came to, with over 300 people helping to kind of heal and bring the sculpture back to life. And I think there could be no better way to celebrate, than have the amazing artist herself, Tschablala. We're so thrilled to have you here at the Pavilion and for your work. If you could all join me in welcoming Tschablala to the Pavilion. And I also just want to say extra thank you to Pilar Correa's Gallery for their amazing support of the sculpture's presentation at the DLWP, and especially to Jessica Ramsey for everything throughout the process of realizing it or presenting it. But today's talk, before we begin, a few words of biography to kind of contextualize the conversation. So through an expansive practice, which brings together painting, printmaking, sculpture, and collage, Tschablala Self's depictions, predominantly of women, traverse different artistic traditions. Black and femme bodies are particularly prevalent in her work, featuring different subjects or characters with individual and powerful identities, many of which are reimagined from chance encounters. Through meditations on race and gender, Self's work is concerned with what it means to flourish as a human and how the self is performed and perceived within contemporary life. Just some of her recent solo and group exhibitions include Kunstmuseum St. Gallen in Switzerland from this year, currently on display, Pilar Correa's Gallery from last year, Le Consortium in Dijon, 2022, the 2021 Performer Biennial in New York, Haus der Kunst Munich, Kunsthalle Düsseldorf, the Baltimore Museum of Art, and ICA Boston. And I think that one of the most striking aspects about Tschablala's practice, which is something that I hope we'll explore in depth today, is its movement between different mediums. As I said, painting, sculpture, textile, film, performance, assemblage, collage, that really initiates a new vernacular and reimagining of black and femme bodies and identities throughout history, throughout time. And Tschablala's presentation here at the Pavilion is of her first ever public sculpture, titled Seated, as I said, as a key part of our 2023 artistic program. The work is a strong, powerful, and beautiful expression of selfhood, but also of leisure, rest, and well-being, which are all things that align with the history, the context, and the values here at the Pavilion. And presenting, as you call it, Shaba, a universal act of leisure and calm. She's a black woman seated on the seafront, looking out to sea, who has as much right to occupy this space as anybody else. And for our conversation today, we thought it would be a great opportunity to dive a bit deeper into Tschablala's practice and how this sculpture sits within that. We'll talk for about 45 minutes, and I'm conscious also about allowing enough time for questions, so there'll be a mic passing around at the end for anyone who would like to ask Tschablala a question. But I guess in the spirit of looking back and situating this public sculpture within your wider practice, I thought it could be interesting maybe to begin at the beginning, really, and ask you how you first came to art. Is it something that you developed at a very young age? And who and what were some of the early inspirations that led you in your developing practice?
Well, I have always done art, even as a child. Art was something that I did as a pastime and something that I did as a hobby. And I was lucky enough for it to be encouraged at home. So I'm the youngest of 5 children, so I think being like the youngest in the family was like indulged quite a bit. So I was given a lot of free reign, had a lot of free time as well. My older siblings They lived in the house until maybe, they're quite a bit older than me, so they lived in the house until maybe I was about 7, and I was used to being around so many people for so long, but then they all kind of moved out or went to college or moved to other cities for periods of time. So then I remember having so much time, kind of like no one to play with or talk to or bother. So art was really kind of my company a lot as a child. And I would say growing up in New York City, it was a very culturally rich community, especially growing up in Harlem. Like Harlem's a very vibrant community. Especially in the 90s, there are a lot of creative people who live there. Not necessarily visual artists, but musicians, actors, writers. So I think just growing up in that kind of environment, it was very inspiring. Plus, my mother took a lot of great care in decorating the home. And she loved to decorate the home in art, and especially art that she felt like reflected our identity. So she had lots of like sculptures from like throughout the Black diaspora, lots of different textiles she would collect. She took a lot of great care to do this. So I just, in the periphery of my family's home, there's always like art, and art that was like culturally significant or imbued with this kind of cultural sensibility.
And were there any particular artists who were important for you during your studies, as you were developing your practice, like later on at school?
Yeah, the artists that became important to me during my studies were actually artists that I was unaware that I had first been introduced to in childhood. So again, kind of growing up in Harlem, the Studio Museum is maybe the main contemporary art institution there. And for many years, they've had this American flag that's hung outside the museum, but the flag is done in the Pan-African colors. And I always just thought that was like a flag that was like a design element. And oftentimes too, during there's like an African American Day parade in Harlem, everyone would have that flag. But when I was in graduate school, I came to realize that was a David Hammond's piece that had been kind of reappropriated and mass produced. But I had no idea that it had those origins. And similarly to like Faith Ringgold, she's an artist that became increasingly important to me when I was in graduate school and college. And then it took me a while to realize that I had her children's book as a kid, and it was one of my favorite books, Tar Beach. So a lot of the artists that became really important to me as I got a bigger awareness of contemporary art, I realized they had always kind of been part of the visual landscape, or kind of a part of my life, even as a child.
And I guess in a way, it's about, I think a lot in your work, there is this interesting relationship to how you bring these characters or these influences to crystallize in the work. And it relates a lot to the sort of notion of portraiture and kind of conceiving and depicting these different characters or icons, or I think you said avatars as well. The people in your works, we've got some photos here just to go through so people can get an impression. But they obviously serve a figurative function, but also maybe symbolic in terms of how you render characters. So could you speak a bit about how you draw your inspiration for, depicting different subjects and characters in your paintings?
Yeah, I generally refer to the work as being figurative as opposed to portraiture, because they're not real people. They are all imagined. So the character is the perfect word to describe them. They are composites. So maybe there are aspects of them that are rooted in real individuals, but a lot of it's also just people I've come across, and also maybe aspirational figures in my mind. So they're really kind of composed of all these different sources, and they're all fictional people for the most part. On occasion, I'll paint someone that I actually know, but generally, these are just imagined figures, and together I imagine them as being this almost pantheon of characters that really describe a lot of the conceptual concerns in my work and a lot of the intentions that I have, like the kind of work that I hope the paintings are doing. So,
I think you said something really interesting once, which was it's not just about trying to define how somebody might look, but how they might feel through the work, and what are the ways that you feel that you kind of convey their sort of impressions, maybe more sensorial based, about the person and their life and who they are and these characters that you're creating?
Well, a lot of the distortion in the work accounts for that. So trying to communicate how an individual might feel as opposed to how they look in real life, that's why the work lends itself more towards these moments of abstraction or distortion as opposed to naturalism. Because I feel like the goal of naturalism is really to render someone as they would appear in front of you, whereas my work kind of goes in a different direction and tries to evoke more of a feeling of a person, more of like an essence, and more of an impression, even possibly a memory. So.
And I think it really relates in a really interesting way to how you are a really amazing storyteller, you know, because it is about conveying this person and their different attributes, but it's also their relationship to everyday social spaces, to communities, like the people they hang out with, what they like to eat, you know, where they like to go, you know, hang out, all these different, this kind of universe that you enter into when you look at the work. You get a sense of, you know, them, but also what's around them and beyond them. And it maybe be great to hear a little bit about some of these social spaces. You know, I'm thinking of the bodega in particular, but, you know, these different worlds that you've tried to depict through these universes.
Well, also, the way in which the paintings in particular are made is somewhat of like a unique process. It's an assemblage and collage process that incorporates a lot of textiles. Some that are found, some that I've inherited, many that are purchased, but they generally compose the figurative aspects of the paintings, and they are sewn directly onto the canvas. So even just using textiles and fabrics which are of the world and already have their own symbolic meaning, I think brings in the power of the everyday, the power of the quotidian, like the power of just the viewer's own free association with a certain kind of texture, color, fabric. So I think because of just the formal aspects of the paintings, they are very much tethered to everyday life because of the use of textiles. And then apart from that, there are some unique series in which I'm exploring environments. You mentioned one, which is Bodega Run. This is a work from a series that looks at the cultural significance of New York City bodegas, which are corner stores that are mostly only found in, I would say, more like lower income neighborhoods in New York City. So you're talking about like Harlem, the Bronx, Lower East Side. And they have, I would say they have both like a beauty to them, but also kind of like a painful aspect to them as well, because the stores are there because there aren't often many grocery stores. These neighborhoods are generally like food deserts. And apart from that, the stores are kind of a catch-all for a lot of other industries that should be there, like, for example, a proper pharmacy or a bank. So they end up selling lots of pain medications, like Tylenol or whatnot. Or they also have ATMs in lieu of proper banking institutions. But they also sell food and a number of other things like loose cigarettes and beer and so on and so forth. So that's one aspect of them. But the other aspect of them is that they become these really interesting multicultural spaces that are so unique to New York and kind of reflect the community outside them in such a beautiful and accurate way. So that's maybe one of the projects in which I did the deepest dive into an environment. And apart from that, more recently, I've been doing a body of work, which actually the sculpture comes out of that series, which is looking at the home and the significance of the domestic space.
Yeah. So. And I think as well, when we look at this kind of series, you know, it is a form of characters and a form of portraiture. I know that you don't necessarily like to describe it like that, but in terms of this universe, it feels incredibly alive and joyful and in motion almost. You know, there's a strong sense of movement to the works that in a way kind of resist that static portraiture gaze of like objectifying something and fixing it with a certain meaning. And I think that also goes back to what you said about, I guess, the kind of physical attributes of the characters that you portray and your use of exaggeration or kind of, you know, in terms of how you're stylistically rendering them on the canvas. And I think that, you know, a lot of these are related to certain cultural myths or cultural assumptions about race, about gender. So yeah, maybe if you could talk a little bit about that in terms of how you visually kind of bring these characters to life, but also perhaps meditate slightly on certain cultural assumptions about these tropes.
And I would say, like, one more point about the Bodega Run series is that, and that series is a portrait, but not so much of the figures that are depicted, but a portrait of the institution, the bodega, the store itself. So in that case, I would say it definitely falls within the realm of portraiture. And for back to like the figures and how they are rendered in the works, I'm thinking about if you're having like a real interaction with the person, kind of how you're not seeing them in their entirety. There's certain aspects of their body or their face or their persona that are kind of popping out to you ahead of others. So an eye, a mouth, a kind of a collarbone, something, hands. So that accounts for why different aspects of their body are larger or smaller in the paintings. And in terms of cultural assumptions, especially as it relates to like the body, women's bodies, black women's bodies, black individuals' bodies in general, I feel like I'm aware of these assumptions as everyone is. So they're embedded in my psyche as much as everyone else's. So there's something that it's another reservoir of, I guess, visual information or cultural information that I'm pulling from. In some instances, I would say I lean into it. In other instances, I say I lean against it. But it's something that is just like every other aspect of any other thing that's in my mind. It comes out in the work, for sure. Yeah.
And I guess it also relates to what we noticed a lot in your work is a shift in perspective and dimensions between a certain flatness, but then also a certain three-dimensionality in other parts. And that, relates to a lot of the materials that you use, the fact that you embed textile into it. It has this textural quality that kind of it sort of becomes a flat image, but then when you look closer, there's a kind of depth there as well. Could you speak a little bit about that? Because it obviously plays into the paintings, but also some of the sculptures that you make as well. We have an image in particular, which for me really does this. It's the way that you might move around this object will shift it from looking flat to 3D and back again. So maybe if you just talk about that in terms of how you play with perspective and dimensions in your work.
Flatness and three-dimensionality are definitely both like formal and conceptual concerns in the work, because I think that my paintings tend to be relatively flat in terms of how they're rendered, in terms of the pictorial space. So there's not generally a large amount of pictorial depth within the picture plane, whereas because of the process, the figures themselves have a certain level of dimensionality because they're sewn and applied onto the main substrate of the canvas. So I think that already is kind of a bit of a tension. There's this flatness, but there is this physical, like built and fashion quality to the paintings. That's something that I play with. But also I would say, conceptually, I think about that too. Like, what does it mean to have a flat understanding of a person? Like, understanding of a person that's superficial or has no dimension to, as opposed to having a more complicated nuance, a more three-dimensional understanding of an individual. So it's something that I think about both in how the work is made, but also a lot of the larger social concerns of which the work is attempting to discuss.
And I guess thinking a bit as well about going deeper into this kind of collecting of textiles, you mentioned it a little while ago, but I guess thinking about how these materials and these textiles are so loaded with people's histories and intimacies and memories, right? So even when they come to you or when you find them, they already come with such a charge. And I recently met the Brazilian artist Sonia Gomez. I don't know if you know her work, but she makes these incredible abstract sculptures which are all constructed with found materials and fabrics, and people actually send them to her, often with a note of where it came from, what it meant to them, and what that memory was. And yeah, I was just curious about your own process of research and collecting with these materials, like how you gather them, and how does it look in your studio in terms of these materials as well?
Well, I actually inherited a lot of fabrics. Like my mother collected fabrics, and also my sisters used to collect a lot of fabrics, mostly because they used to, especially when I was a kid in the 90s, they would always wrap their hair with fabrics. Like my sisters had very, very long locks, so they would wrap their hair like really high up with like fabrics that they would buy always like on 125th Street or wherever. And I guess that style, they moved on past that style, and then we still had lots of the fabrics at home.
Yeah.
So I have so much fabric at home from just that period of time. And then apart from that, just traveling different places, I always kind of take the opportunity to buy some bit of textile. And I have been lucky enough that more people are aware of my work. Friends or neighbors will also give me fabric that they come across that they find interesting. And occasionally I also purchase it. Because I'm only using little bits and pieces, I'm not using the fabric in a more traditional sense, so I'm not using yards and yards at a time. I end up having lots of scraps, and the scraps themselves get sewn together and then become their own like sort of tapestries. Yeah. So in some instances, it's like a bit of a cannibalistic process in the studio. The fabric is kind of being eaten away at and then put back together and then cut up again. And that's my palette primarily, and all the paintings generally start from that point, kind of pulling out of these bins the bits and pieces of fabric and starting to build the figures from that material.
I think I read somewhere you describing it almost as like a kind of Frankensteinian process in a way, in terms of how these different fragments come together. Yeah. And I guess maybe to come to the series of works that you mentioned about the domestic space. And this was very much the subject of your solo exhibition at Pilar Correas last year, which is called Homebody. And it was also about the domestic space, but also perhaps the aesthetics of leisure and what that means through certain objects, items of furniture. Could you speak a bit more about your kind of how you came to this topic and how you explored it? Because as you say, it also relates, of course, to the sculpture.
So there was one particular series of paintings that was included in that body of work, which were called the leisure paintings. And these paintings were done in a slightly different process. They all had a foundation of silkscreen to them, and then they were further worked on from that point. And they were actually born out of a work on paper series that I had done in 2021 that was connected to my Performa commission. And the Performa commission, just to give some context, was a play that depicted two characters that were played by 4 actors. So there's a little bit of repetition in terms of the doubling of the cast. And they recited one monologue that was done in 3 iterations over the course of 45 minutes. And in the process of preparing for the play, I wanted to aestheticize the entire environment. So I created furniture pieces that were to be used on the stage as set elements. So if you were to look at one like this painting, for example, the chair, that is one of the original drawings for the design for the chair that became made and actually, made for the set. So these chair drawings are in each one of these paintings, and for me, each one is activated by the portraits. It's always the same figure, either a male or a woman or a man, and you see them in maybe slight alterations from scene to scene, and there's slight changes in the environment that they're placed within. So the entire series that has been dedicated to the domestic is also, it's talking about the home as a site, but it's also talking about the home in terms of the space that it occupies in the mind, like a space for interiority, a space for privacy, or at least a space that has the expectation for those things. So I was exploring those ideas with the 2-dimensional works, but as the series evolved and I started to explore these same figures, but in 3 dimensions, it became a conversation more about leisure, the politics around rest, the politics around to be seated, to take a seat, to take up space. And I was exploring that more as a cultural, as like instances in society where seating itself have been politicized, especially back in America. Thinking about during Jim Crow and the anti-desegregation movement, the politicization of seating and how that was regulated by state legislation in often cases. And also just what does the seat kind of culturally, in a more general cultural sense and maybe even transnational sense, like what does the seat represent? I think that is something that is so ubiquitous, so people maybe don't even give much thought to the space that it holds psychologically. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think you mentioned before about discovering this phrase in the UK of becoming part of the furniture, which kind of, evokes that feeling of an interiority or a receding, from the exposure of exterior life and finding that that private life essentially. And I think, it's like what you said. It's like who has a right to have interiority, to have the time to that's free from labor and can resist it and can take leisure in a way, and how that is super politicized. And I guess this exhibition was happening at the same time that you made the sculpture, Seated. So this was at Pilar Correa's gallery in central London, and then also the sculpture was launched at Coldrops Yard, which is in King's Cross. I think I've got a photo of it here. Could you maybe just speak a little bit about that process of making the sculpture, your first public sculpture?
So if you think back to the leisure painting that was showed previously, the sculpture is really a three-dimensional version of the exact works from that series. So it retains quite a lot of that distortion and trying to still have this flatness to its frontal perspective while being an object that can function within 3D. So that accounts, the fact that it was originally this almost like flattened drawing accounts for a lot of the proportions and composition of the figure. And the process was that I took one of these original works and digitally I rendered it out to create this dimensional form. It was 3D printed in Spain, and then the 3D print to scale was used to create a mold. From the mold, it was then casted into with bronze. So that's a little bit of the process. Maybe not so interesting, but
it definitely is, yeah. And you can see here a small bronze maquette as well of the object. And I guess I'm curious as well, because when I saw the exhibition in London, it felt very much a figure that is inside, that's that is resting in a private space. So here you have that shift of that image to then like a very open public space in the centre of London in a shopping mall. So how was that in terms of trying to shift that aesthetic or that gesture from private to public in a way? Well,
it just shows how the same exact. It talks for me. It's significant about what is the significance of iconography, for example. Like you can have the same exact image, but in a different context, takes on a completely different meaning. So the series, when it's shown within a private space, even if the private space is a gallery or a museum, which is a public institution, but it's still a relatively private space, it has a much different, I think, it makes a much different impression on the viewer. And also, I think the ideas around the piece shifts, because the homebody exhibition at Pilar Correa's was a lot about what does it mean to kind of recede within the domestic space, to kind of go into oneself, either by choice or because that space becomes oppressive in some kind of way. So I think a lot of the concerns in that show spoke to more humanistic concerns, more existential concerns, whereas when you take the same exact object or the same exact image and put it within the public sphere, it becomes a different conversation, one more about history and one more about social, contemporary and past social conditions. So for me, it's been a really interesting process, and it's one I'm still unpacking and learning from, but it's something that I'm very much intrigued by, and I'm still learning through this whole experience the importance and the power of public art because of the difference.
Yeah, that's what we were speaking about that yesterday. I guess it's like that. What does it mean to present something that's outside of that protective shell of the museum or the art gallery? And the presentation of this work here in Bexhill has obviously been such an interesting example of that, of seeing how it plays out. And as I said at the start, this act of vandalism where the perpetrators covered the entirety of the skin with white paint, but then to see the community response and how people came together, it really kind of in a very short space of time just showed the I guess maybe sense of ownership, or kind of what's at stake in terms of an object and what it represents and how people want to protect it, care for it. You know, it becomes part of a much wider conversation that's related to the local context, really. So I guess, do you have any reflections, I guess, on the kind of the last 6 weeks, essentially, since it's been presented within the context of Bexhill?
Well, I mainly want to just express like gratitude for everyone that participated in the work's restoration. And I feel like that's really the main story out of the whole experience, is that so many people came and they repaired the sculpture, they participated in the sculpture's making, to be honest. I feel like at this point, every single person that touched the work and for its restoration is now one of the makers of the piece. And that's, I think, the real purpose of public art, is for the community to have ownership. And that doesn't happen, I think, when art's shown in a different context. I mean, you're not even allowed to touch art in general, in most contexts, but with the public sculpture, even under normal circumstances, that's something that's more acceptable. But in this circumstance, I think that the sculpture is very much owned now by the community here because of the huge community support.
And it's so true, actually, what you said about touch, because that, you know, people were definitely touching it on that Sunday, you know, when people queued up and really, you know, just to sort of take part in that process and queue up for nearly 2 hours just for a couple of minutes to be able to do it, it felt very significant. But yeah, having that physical contact with the piece. And I guess one other question I wanted to ask you about this sculpture, and I guess it connects to your wider practice, is you said something about the desire that your not wanting to have a preconception about how your visitors should experience it or what they should feel, but this kind of idea of the transcendent moment or the transformative moment and what it might spark, you know, even just for a moment of clarity or calm. Could you speak a bit about that in terms of how the visitor experiences what you're putting out there?
Yeah, I mean, my desire for all of the works, seated included, is that people come to it with an open mind and that they leave the work feeling different in some kind of way. So I am always hoping for some level of transformation, even if it's a momentary shift in mood, or even a momentary, even if it's a moment of kind of forgetting about what was on your mind previously, some kind of transportation, psychologically or emotionally. I feel like the work is successful in that regard. But this piece, because it obviously not under the best circumstances originally, but it created such a big conversation, a conversation that I did want to have in regard to the artwork. I feel like it has been very successful. I wouldn't have imagined we would have arrived at it through these circumstances, but regardless, the destination is where I did hope to be with the artwork. So.
And I guess thinking forward, you mentioned yesterday how you have thinking about making more sculptures, and do you feel that this might become more embedded within your practice, you know, making more objects?
Yeah, I do. I'm curious to see where my practice will lead. A lot of times I really follow the needs of the work, so I'm not necessarily making such a conscious decision like I'm going to work in this medium or that medium. Sometimes it's an opportunity arises, so I try to fulfill the opportunity. So I'll kind of go out of my comfort zone for those reasons. And also sometimes the work just, it needs a different medium for the idea to be expressed the most successfully. So.
Sure. And I guess also maybe just to mention, you also presented an amazing sculpture in Palm Springs this year, wasn't it, as well? Yeah, at Desert X, which you called is it a kind of homage, really, to different foremothers of America, and yeah, maybe if you could talk a little bit about this project, because it's very interesting too, in a very different way.
I created a sculpture for Desert X called Pioneer, and it was a sculpture that kind of took after the kind of American equestrian-themed sculptures. So it showed a woman on a horse, and I imagined the woman as being a foremother. And she was there to embody the many indigenous and African women that were involved in the building of America, but who often are not remembered or acknowledged as being part of that legacy. So that sculpture was shown in the desert in Palm Springs, and the West in general, California, it holds a special place in the American psyche as being in the last frontier and kind of like the final frontier. And it's a common belief in America, this kind of historical concept of like a manifest destiny, that America was always meant to be, I guess, conquered and taken over, and that the conquest of the West, if that was possible, was going to be like a realization of this destiny. So it was particularly important to have the sculpture there in California in the desert. Also, just in general, I think in the West, the desert has a very like almost religious significance, and it has this, despite it being so culturally charged, the landscape has almost this neutrality to it because of how it looks, how it appears, and the level of isolation one can feel within that space and the expansiveness. So for all these various reasons, when I was first approached by Desert X, I knew I wanted to build something that was more of a monument. So I would say that sculpture, that piece is very different from this one, as I would describe that piece as a monument, whereas this piece is a proper sculpture. And that's just kind of more of a difference in terms of like thought process and my intentions for the work.
And it's interesting how you were speaking about context there, because the thing about this placement being by the sea, this in a very different way as a landscape, it's in tension between a sort of space of serenity, fluidity, meditation, but also the sea is an incredibly politicized, culturally politicized space as well, especially the English Channel. So just thinking about that kind of tension that exists with the presentation of this work as well, with all of the ideas that circulate around it. Yeah. I'm conscious of time, and I'd love to open it out to questions, if anybody would like to ask Shaba something.
Okay, I'm going to start here.
To me, your work often feels very musical, and I was just wondering if you listen to music whilst you're making, and if so, would you share what you listen to?
Well, when I'm actually in the studio, I don't listen to so much music there. I listen to a lot of like radio, like NPR, it's like a national radio station back home. But I do listen to a lot of music when I'm driving. And just until recently, I drove a lot because my studio was very far from where I lived. But I like to listen to R&B, jazz. I love hip hop, but I don't listen to it as much as I used to. Maybe on the weekends more now. And then I listen to all kind of music. And I live in a kind of a rural area at this point. I moved out of the city to upstate New York. So I actually like country music and soft rock now, because they always play on the radio, so, yeah.
Hello. Mine isn't really a question, it's just to say thank you for creating something, a piece of art that I can look at and relate to as who I am. I grew up, I was born and bred in Bexhill, and this is the first time that I've been able to look at a piece of art and been able to see myself in it. I don't know why I'm getting emotional, but I just wanted to say thank you. It's a beautiful piece, and I'm very honoured that it's here in the town that I grew up in, so thank you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to have it here, honestly. Thank you.
Hello, lovely talk. Thank you very much, and wonderful sculpture. You mentioned a little bit about history in your mind when you're creating a piece, and there's a history in the Delaware of a lost bronze sculpture called Persephone, and I wondered if that had any influence on you.
And the question was about the history of the sculptures here at the institution?
The history of there was once a bronze statue that was commissioned for the Delaware Pavilion when it was designed. And I think it was made, but it got melted down, I think, and it's always been lost. I think there's a maquette somewhere, and it was called Persephone. But because it was bronze and it was meant to be rather monumental, I wondered whether that had any influence on your thinking when you were creating your seated woman.
I think it actually was part of Joseph's idea, and even having the work come out here, and that was kind of the thought process of bringing Seated to Delaware and to have her out by the sea. So I remember we spoke about that maybe during the planning, some of the initial planning for the show. So it's definitely something that was involved in even the idea of bringing this contemporary female figure to the institution. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was brilliant, lovely to hear everything you had to say. I don't really know if I have a question. It's more, I just need to say this, really. I've just been so touched by the first time I saw the sculpture. It was just like, wow, the power is just so phenomenal. And then I was just so hurt by what happened. And it's really made me really emotional listening today. And the last few weeks has been really upsetting, and then I was so touched when so many people came together to, stand up against what happened. And I've just been so touched today by hearing and following you on Instagram, and I've discovered your work through Instagram and introduced you to all of my daughters. So it's just been such an amazing transformative experience having your sculpture here. And in a way, it's really awful, but actually the whole experience, the negative and the positive, has been so transformative. So yeah, I just wanted to say that, really.
It kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier during the talk about the ultimate goal of the work is for a transformation. And transformations can be destructive sometimes, and it could be something that feels like you have no control of in the midst of it. And I think that's definitely something that no one would have anticipated it, but collectively, we've all experienced that together because of the vandalism. Now on the other side of it, I think that the transformation has been one that has elevated the artwork. It's definitely elevated my engagement with public art and my dedication to it. And I think ultimately, despite a very chaotic beginning, it has been a beautiful experience on the other side of it. Thank you.
Is there questions on this side? Sorry, let me just.
Sort of seeing the sculpture here feels really, I don't know, it feels like such a perfect setting, as in like looking out to the sea, and especially as we like come into sort of summer and the way that the light has changed, like when it's really, sometimes it feels really dark here in the winter, so then having this sort of like breath of air and like the sort of, the way that she is sort of seated in the openness of her body and her shoulders, and I was just wondering, although for me it feels like, oh my God, this is where it was made to be, and obviously in King's Cross that's a very different setting. Do you have any kind of like other spaces or areas that you kind of would like, you imagine or you would wish for her to sort of transfer and take space?
I do feel like she looks particularly beautiful here by the sea as well. And the funny thing about it being by the sea too is that in some ways, this sculpture is related to my Performa commission because of the chair, and the chair was first designed for that commission. And in my first proposal for the play, we were looking at, it was meant to always be in a band shell, and one of the first band shells we looked at was one in Harlem that was in a park by the water. So for being by the water with one of my works has been in my mind since about 2021. So it is really nice to see the sculpture here, by the water, in more of a natural environment. I think it has a different meaning. It had a different meaning in Coldrop's Yard, which I think was a very good presentation for it. It may be a good first presentation, but this is like a whole different iteration of it. So it has a different life here. And I think another location that could be interesting is an even more pastoral environment, like maybe an environment where she can be surrounded by green, like trees, something like that. So we'll see. Yeah, different places. Yeah. She looks so different, different places, and it takes on different meanings. So it's interesting to watch. So.
I reiterate everything everyone else has said about how wonderful the sculpture is, and I'm particularly touched as a woman and as an American woman, you might guess that, even though I've been here for 40 years. But I love the way that you're kind of rewriting some of American history with your sculptures and things. And I'm just thinking, if you were commissioned, wouldn't that be lovely, to redo Mount Rushmore? What four women would you put up there?
Oh my God, I have to do a little bit of research for that one. But I can think of one. I would definitely say Harriet Tubman. A lot of people forget that she actually also led a battle during the Civil War, and she's actually an official American veteran because of that reason. So a lot of people don't know that part about her history, which is actually really interesting. So she would definitely be one, but I have to do a little bit more research, you know. So, like,
It's not really a question, really. I just wanted to sort of add to what other people have said. And thank you for coming and talking to us and explaining about your work. And I just wanted to say as well that for me, I don't see terribly well all the time. So it's really, I'm partially sighted. So it's really great for me to have the opportunity to, because of the vandalism, to actually get up physically close to your work and actually touch it and sort of engage with it. And that was really... It was. I think you said as well. It was a good thing that came out of something so horrendous, but it was really fantastic to see people, you know, up close and physically being connected to it. And I think, as you said, we all now probably feel that we do own a little bit of it. So I hope it stays for a long time. Our work, that is. Thank you, it's really fabulous. And that makes a brilliant postcard. I don't know if anybody's going to do postcards. That's so lovely.
I've just got one question with regards to outline and like the history within like cartoon of like the black line like tracing bodies. And I wonder if like that history of like implying three-dimensional space within two-dimensional drawing is something that you reference?
Well, definitely in this work, yeah, very few people notice that it has this black outline. It's kind of to nod to the drawing series that was very, very flat with that super graphic black line, which is from the silkscreen. And in the paintings themselves, they do have this really intense linear element. It's not drawn, but it's from the sewing machine. So lines and kind of drawing, either through the sewing machine or by hand, it's a big part of the aesthetic of the work. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I think that just leaves me to say thank you so very much to Tschablala for
you.
being
Thank
here.
You all.
I think we can all agree that seated is here to stay. So please give Shaba a huge round of applause. And I'd also like to invite you all down to the sculpture. We're going to be having a gathering, a picnic as well, really a moment of celebration and coming together around this joyful piece. So yeah, thank you all again for coming.
Thank you.